They were gods carved out of fame, dressed in power, and armed with charm that could melt resistance. Sean Diddy Combs and Russell Brand stood on two ends of the entertainment spectrum, yet both thrived in empires designed to worship charisma and crush silence. Diddy, the mogul from Harlem, transformed himself into a symbol of American hip-hop royalty, building Bad Boy Records into an industry behemoth, partnering with fashion houses, alcohol brands, and media ventures, while portraying himself as a mentor, lover, and cultural icon. But beneath the silk suits and flashing lights existed a pattern of darkness that spanned decades. It wasn't until 2023 that the cracks finally shattered the glass. It started with Cassie Ventura, the artist he signed, dated, and allegedly dominated. Her lawsuit detailed not just the trauma of an abusive relationship, but an entire system of fear, surveillance, and control, including beatings, forced sex, druggings, and a twisted maze of power. Games cloaked behind luxury. And as her story emerged, so did dozens of others, over 60 women. Some celebrities, others forgotten industry players, assistants, dancers, models, each painting a disturbingly similar portrait of coercion and violation at the hands of men the world had celebrated. And while civil lawsuits mounted, the real blow came before federal lawsuits, where the U.S. government began probing allegations of sex trafficking, coercive enterprise, and a criminal network masked as a music empire, with raids carried out at his New York and Los Angeles homes, security camera footage collected, NDAs broken, and the silence that surrounded his legend slowly decomposing under the weight of collective voices. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Russell Brand's downfall was taking a different shape, emerging not from a sudden collapse, but from a long, simmering collection of allegations that had been whispered for years, until finally, in 2025, the BBC and Channel 4 released a documentary in which 4 women publicly accused him of sexual misconduct, including rape, psychological manipulation, and coercive control. One victim had been only 16 when Brand allegedly began a sexual relationship with her. Others described being assaulted during his rise to comedic stardom between 1999 and 2005, and what shook the public wasn't just the stories themselves, but how closely they mirrored the brand of masculinity Russell had flaunted in public for years, always, towing the line between edgy and inappropriate. But now, edgy had a body count, inappropriate had become criminal, and his spiritual guru persona on YouTube only made the contrast more grotesque, as he tried to deflect the charges with cryptic statements about cancel culture and media conspiracies, while his victims, now women with families and jobs and lives long separated from their pain, began taking back their power one sentence at a time, as both men faced unprecedented legal and social scrutiny. The world was forced to confront the systems that enabled them. Because neither man had operated in isolation, they were surrounded by enablers, lawyers, managers, security guards, assistants, PR teams, and collaborators who either turned a blind eye or actively protected them. And the more victims spoke, the more the machinery around these men began to unravel, exposing club owners who knowingly allowed underage girls into VIP lounges, producers who ignored warning signs in exchange for money, and entire corporations that thrived off their stars' chaos, silencing accusers with legal threats, hush money, or sheer intimidation. And while the headlines focus on the men, the real way the story lived in the women who had spent decades living with invisible bruises, emotional wreckage, and internalized belief that no one would ever believe them. Because who could believe that the man who danced on stage with $1 million smile or made audiences laugh with razor sharp could be capable of such cruelty? But the illusion had cracked now, and behind the smiles and stage lights were hotels' rooms filled with screaming, studios echoing with silence, and social media timelines where victims scrolled through fan comments idolizing their abusers, wondering how long they'd had to wait to be believed. And in courtrooms across New York, Miami, and London, those voices finally rose, trembling but unshaken, each testimony adding to a tidal wave that no brand, no empire, no godlike image could resist. Cassie stood with steady eyes and a soul stitched back together through time, saying she no longer feared him, while another woman, testifying under pseudonym, described waking up in a strange house, her clothes inside out, her memory blank, her trust permanently broken, and another, who had once done makeup on tour, recounted being followed for weeks after rejecting an invitation to Diddy's penthouse, with her car tires slashed and voicemail, threats filling her inbox until she moved states. Russell's victims painted equally haunting portraits, one recalling a time she tried to leave his apartment but found the door locked and his tone suddenly darker than she'd ever heard, another who said she'd been choked during an argument over a text message, another who was told, "You're lucky to be with me," as justification for control he exercised over her clothing, phone, and job. In every case, there was a pattern: fame used as leverage, power as a weapon, apologies as manipulation, and silence as survival. And while some still defended the men, others asked why it took decades for justice to catch up, why wealth could still delay consequences, and why the world let brilliance overshadow basic decency. Social media exploded with fury, disbelief, and solidarity. Surviving Diddy and Brand the Truth trended for weeks. Influencers shifted their loyalty, clips from old interviews were replayed with new context, and the internet became an evolving archive of red flags everyone once ignored, but now saw with terrifying clarity. And even as lawsuits moved slowly, reputations crumbled fast. Endorsement deals severed ties, platforms demonetized accounts, business partners distanced themselves, and fans turned followers into critics, forcing both Diddy and Russell into exile, not behind bars yet, but behind a wall of irreversible public shame. And yet, as the lawsuits gained traction and the voices became harder to ignore, a new reality began to emerge. Not just about the men who caused the harm, but about the women who carried the burden of it for years in silence, self-blame, and shattered identity. Some were now mothers, some still struggled with addiction. Others had moved far from the cities that once promised them dreams, only to deliver trauma. And as they took the stand, their stories painted a haunting collage of pain that stretched beyond the acts of assault and into the aftermath. Panic attacks in grocery stores, nightmares that replayed hotel rooms, intimacy that now felt unsafe, careers that never took off because they refused to play along. And while they each came from different places, New York, Atlanta, London, Manchester, the thread connecting them was unmistakable. They had all trusted men who wore masks, who smiled in public and shattered them in private. And as the media clung to every detail, the courtrooms themselves became emotional war zones. Diddy arriving in sunglasses and silence, his lawyers speaking more than he ever would, carefully painting him as a victim of celebrity targeting. While across from him sat rows of women who had memorized the wallpaper in his mansions, who could recall every inch of the hallways where they were dragged, screamed at, or drugged. They sat beside one another, not holding hands, but holding space for each other's pain. And Russell, walking into a London courtroom with his trademark scarf and beard, looking like a spiritual prophet, now stripped of his charm, faced not just the women who accused him, but the audience that once laughed with him now staring at him in stunned disgust. And as testimony played from one victim, describing the moment she tried to leave his, Flatney slammed the door, shouting, "You think you can reject me?" The courtroom fell silent. Not even the judge moved, and in that breathless moment, it was clear this wasn't about sex. It was about power, about control, about need to dominate and destroy, cloaked in wit or wealth. Meanwhile, former insiders began to speak. Diddy's old drivers, assistants, dancers, and even one ex-bodyguard who had been present at several private parties revealed how women were flown in, phones were taken, and guests were warned not to ask too many questions. And while he admitted to feeling guilt, he said, "I was feeding my kids." You try telling a billionaire no when he tells you to shut the door and wait outside. Another assistant recalled being told to delete footage from a hallway camera that caught a woman stumbling half-conscious out of bedroom. And Russell's former tour manager claimed he had to screen girls backstage, making sure they were hot, young, and submissive, a task he admitted he hated, but did because he was paid more than he'd ever been paid in his life. And as these stories accumulated, they didn't just take down the stars. They exposed an ecosystem, an entire industry built on secrecy and loyalty and the unspoken rule. Don't ask questions, don't get involved. And while fans argued online, some defending their idols with aggressive denial, others calling for arrests, the truth sat there, impossible to ignore, tangled in court documents, in tearful testimonies, in decades of trauma that no apology, no amount of spiritual posturing or legal maneuvering could undo. Even as both men released carefully crafted statements, Diddy calling the allegations false and offensive, Russell suggesting they were a distraction from the truth he was trying to share with the world. The public no longer listened. They saw the pattern too clearly now, the manipulation too well documented, and slowly the media narrative shifted from focusing on the accused to elevating the accusers, giving space to women who had been invisible for too long. Their pain once a footnote, now the headline. And still, the legal machinery turned slowly. Trial dates postponed, lawyers requesting more time, judges navigating high-profile chaos. But outside, something more important was happening. A cultural shift, a collective awakening to how power functions when it's worshipped blindly, and how predators don't always hide in darkness. Sometimes they dance in the spotlight. Women who had never met Diddy or Russell began sharing their own stories. Stories that didn't involve celebrities, but followed the same blueprint. A charming man, a safe space turned dangerous, silence bought with shame, and justice that always felt out of reach. And so, the fall of these two giants became symbolic of an era ending, of a truth too long ignored, of a reckoning delayed but not denied. And while Diddy retreated into a mansion he no longer owned, and Russell's YouTube channel stopped uploading, the world moved forward without them. Not unscarred, but unchained, slowly learning how to believe women, how to question fame, how to dismantle the myth that brilliance excuses abuse, and most of all, how to stand in the face of power and say, "We're not afraid of you anymore." And even as their public personas unraveled thread by thread, what emerged wasn't just justice in motion, but the haunting echo of everything that had been allowed to fester behind wealth and applause, because both men, despite their different careers and countries, had mastered the art of camouflage. Diddy wrapped his control in opulence, making every threat sound like mentorship, every party a networking event, every bruise a result of miscommunication, while Russell twisted intelligence into manipulation, using big words and spiritual nonsense to confuse, deflect, and ultimately dominate. But now the camouflage was torn apart, and beneath it stood two men not unlike the monsters women encounter every day, only richer, louder, and more protected. Across television screens, documentaries aired exposing the pattern, a behavior that had been hiding in plain sight. Clips of Diddy laughing with hosts about his wild parties, now spliced against Survivor interviews describing nights of fear. Footage of Russell making jokes about rape and stand-up routines now replayed with chilling weight, while former co-hosts admitted they felt uneasy for years, but never spoke out because it wasn't their place. And that confession, "It wasn't my place," echoed louder than any scream, because it was everyone's place. And no one had dared to risk their seat at the table to stand up for the girls being devoured at the edges of those tables. One victim described watching Diddy on TV after her assault, remembering how everyone around her still adored him, how she felt invisible, like she didn't exist anymore. And for years she avoided mirrors, avoided intimacy, avoided herself, because trauma doesn't end when the moment ends. It lingers, stains, distorts, and becomes part of your breath. Another said she stopped singing after her experience with Diddy because the industry became synonymous with fear. Studios reminded her of hotel rooms, microphones of his voice saying, "Don't ruin this." And so she bared her talent just to feel safe. Russell's victims describe how their pain was turned into jokes, how their trauma became punchlines they had to pretend were clever, because the audience was laughing, and they weren't. They were just sensitive, just bitter, and that gaslighting bled into every part of their lives until they no longer trusted their own memories. The world began to realize these weren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of disease called unchecked fame, and as more women came forward, not just against these men, but against others in music, comedy, and entertainment, the internet became a graveyard of reputations built on bones. Brand partnerships vanished. Ciroc ended ties with Diddy. Publishers dropped Russell's pending books. Former collaborators rushed to scrub their names from past projects, and fans who once shouted lyrics or quoted stand-up routines now sat in quiet reflection, wondering how long they'd cheer for someone capable of such harm. But the victims didn't want pity. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted healing. They wanted the world to stop pretending that charm equals character, or that talent is a shield from accountability. Meanwhile, both Diddy and Russell began to spiral. Diddy released a string of emotionless statements through lawyers, then fell silent altogether as more legal actions poured in, and rumors swirled about financial collapse, panic attacks, and paranoia inside his once booming empire. Russell's YouTube channel, once a haven for spiritual seekers and conspiracy theorists, became a ghost town. His comments flooded with rage, disappointment, and demands for answers. And though he tried to keep up the facade of victimhood, the mask no longer fit. The eyes behind it were tired, exposed, and alone. Court dates loomed closer, and both men were faced not only with the law, but with a mirror, with a thousand of people staring back at them now unafraid to speak the truth, and still, their defenders clung to conspiracy theories, claiming it was a hit job, a witch hunt, a deep state attack, unable or unwilling to admit that maybe, just maybe, the men they worshipped had built their fame on a foundation of pain, not greatness. And through it all, the victims endured. The media frenzy, the death threats, the trolls, the re-traumatization that came with telling their stories again and again to strangers who still asked, "Why didn't you speak up sooner?" As if silence was a choice, as if survival was weak, and yet they stood, some with their names hidden, others boldly reclaiming the very identities that had been broken. And they didn't just want jail time or headlines. They wanted change. They wanted the system to acknowledge that protecting powerful men while devouring vulnerable women was no longer acceptable, and that entertainment was not a free pass to erase humanity. And then came the aftermath. Not the courtroom verdicts, which were still pending, not the financial losses, which though massive, meant little to men who once believed themselves invincible, but the spiritual, cultural, and societal aftermath, the kind of shift that doesn't happen overnight, but leaves a permanent mark on the landscape of fame and power, because what the world had witnessed wasn't just exposure to abusers. It was exposure to a system built to nurture them, to enable them, to reward them while burying the bodies of broken dreams behind contracts, settlements, and stage apologies. Former fans found themselves questioning how they had once danced to Diddy songs at weddings or repeated Russell's jokes in dorm rooms, suddenly realizing those catchy lyrics and clever punchlines now echoed with pain they hadn't heard before, because when truth reveals itself, it recolors everything and nothing sounds the same again. A stylist who once worked on Diddy's music video described crying in the car after seeing a scene that reminded her of a girl she once saw crying in a hallway with mascara running down her face. She hadn't spoken then, thinking it wasn't her business, but now she saw her silence for what it was. Complicity, and an intern on Russell's old radio show admitted he used to laugh when Russell flirted aggressively with female guests, only later understanding that what he witnessed wasn't comedy. It was a blueprint of abuse, sugar-coated and aired to millions. The internet turned their stories into fuel for movements. Women held digital vigils. Survivor support groups formed under usernames and aliases, and trauma therapists hosted live streams breaking down the psychology of coercive control, explaining why women stay, why they freeze, and why survival sometimes looks like silence, not resistance. Meanwhile, the media slowly shifted its lens from spectacle to substance. Editors who once glamorized Diddy's lifestyle were now publishing long-form reports on the abuse hidden behind luxury. And networks that once invited Russell for provocative interviews began airing documentaries, exposing how long they ignored the warning signs. In the midst of this reckoning, both men were ghosts. In the world they once owned, Diddy pacing inside a mansion stripped of meaning, surrounded by staff who no longer spoke, afraid of every knock at the door, every phone call, wondering if this time would be an arrest warrant instead of lawsuit, while Russell, living off-grid in the English countryside, posted vague spiritual monologues that no longer inspired, but unsettled, his once devoted fan base dwindling to a few who couldn't let go of the man they thought he was. And yet, neither man offered real accountability. not the kind that requires humility, grief, and surrender, but instead they clung to narratives of persecution, delusionally framing themselves as martyrs of fame, victims of the culture they once exploited, still unable to look in the mirror and see the wreckage behind them. But the world had moved on, and so had their victims, not in the sense of healing fully, but in the act of reclaiming breath, time, identity, in speaking their names without shame, in walking into spaces without shrinking, and most importantly, in knowing they weren't alone anymore. One survivor said, "For the first time in my life, I'm not whispering," and those words echoed louder than any beat Diddy ever produced or any punchline Russell ever delivered, because in them lived the power that these men tried to take away, the power to exist freely, to speak fully, to be human without fear. And as the entertainment industry began reevaluating its own culture of silence, as executives were forced to address whispers that had been ignored for decades, as fans demanded transparency from the people they supported, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but undeniably, because once truth is spoken, it cannot be unheard, and the myth of the untouchable star began to crumble, replaced not by cynicism, but by clarity. And so, the empire's shadows finally collapsed, not in a single moment, not with a single headline, but piece by piece, as the truth carved its way through the concrete of celebrity, and in its place, a new foundation slowly began to rise, not yet whole, but rooted in reality, in resistance, and in the unshakable belief that no matter how many walls power build around itself, the voices of the wounded will find a way in, and when they do not knock, they roar. They were gods wrapped in diamonds, dressed in lies, untouchable in fame, and insulated by money, charm, and an audience too intoxicated by brilliance to see the blood beneath the glitter. Sean Diddy Combs and Russell Brand stood like titans in their industries. One the slick, powerful mogul who redefined hip-hop's image from street to skyscraper, the other a chaotic British comic-turned-wisdom merchant whose twisted charisma won him fans across film, television, and eventually pseudo-spiritual YouTube sermons. But behind the cameras, the Grammys, the late-night sets, the sold-out shows and fragrance lines, lay something darker, more insidious, a series of silent screams trapped inside penthouse suites, dressing rooms, recording studios, and hotel hallways. And it took years, decades, even, for those screams to form words, for victims once silenced by fear and contrition and shame to finally speak into a world that, for the first time, seemed ready to hear them. It began with a single lawsuit in 2023, when Cassie Ventura, once Diddy's lover, muse, and sign artist, filed a civil suit that cracked the glass walls of his empire, alleging rape, physical abuse, drugging, forced intimacy, emotional manipulation, and surveillance across years of entanglement with the music mogul. And what followed was not disbelief, as it might have been in another era, but an avalanche of recognition, as if her pain unlocked the floodgates for 60 other women, each carrying years of silence inside their chests, to come forward with stories frighteningly similar in detail and tone. Women who had been dancers, assistants, stylists, house staff, interns, groupies, and sometimes just guests in the wrong place at the wrong time, all describing an environment where fear was normal, where submission was survival, and where Diddy was not just a star but a tyrant, with eyes in every room, a temper that erupted without warning, and an appetite for control that poisoned every interaction. And as their lawsuits piled up, more than 60 in total, the Justice Department stepped in, filing 4 federal suits alleging sex trafficking, coercive enterprise, and criminal conspiracy, launching full-blown investigations that led to raids on Diddy's mansions in Los Angeles, Miami, and New York, where hard drives were seized, staff questioned, secret rooms uncovered, and NDAs once used like currency began to fall apart, exposing a vast and deeply organized system of abuse built around a man who had long presented himself as a cultural savior. While across the Atlantic in London, the walls began closing in on Russell Brand, who had reinvented himself from vulgar comic and sex addict to enlightened truth seeker and social media mystic, drawing millions of subscribers with his rants on freedom, corruption, and the human soul. But beneath the lotus flowers and chakra talk was a pattern of behavior dating back to 1999, when a first known incident occurred, and by 2025, the BBC and Channel 4 jointly released a documentary featuring 4 brave women, each accusing Brand of sexual assault, rape, manipulation, and emotional degradation between the years of 1999 and 2005, while he was at the height of his fame, working as a radio host, comedian, and television personality. One woman, who was 16 at the time, detailed being groomed, isolated, and sexually abused under the guise of love and mentorship, while another described being held down in a hotel room in Los Angeles as she screamed for him to stop. And another remembered how he used spirituality and intellectualism as tools of coercion, speaking in paradoxes, confusing consent, and making them feel complicit in their own abuse, because that was a real weapon both men had. Not just status or money, but the terrifying power to warp reality, to make women feel like they'd asked for it, stayed too long, drank too much, smiled too wide. And as these stories began colliding in the public arena, American headlines drenched in legal filings against Diddy, British tabloids buzzing with outrage over Brand. What emerged was a chilling parallel. 2 men in different parts of the world, in different industries, using the same playbook. Seduce with charm, isolate with status, manipulate with words, dominate with fear, and silence with shame. Yet for all the similarities, what made this reckoning unprecedented was not just the magnitude of allegations, but the shifting tide of public sentiment. because for the first time, the world didn't automatically defend the powerful. It listened, and in the deafening silence of these men's empires collapsing, the voices of victims rang like thunder in a long-awaited storm. Courtrooms filled with sobbing testimonies and ice-cold glares, with women who'd been afraid for years now holding their ground under oath, describing memories they'd once buried under addiction, depression, or denial, now reanimated under the fluorescent lights of justice. One woman who accused Diddy of raping her in a studio closet said she kept her mouth shut for 12 years because she thought no one would believe her against a billionaire, while another said she watched Brand laugh on national TV, making jokes about women, after he assaulted her backstage, and she sat there in her small apartment, vomiting into a trash can while the world applauded him, wondering if she was losing her mind, because how could someone so celebrated be so cruel? How could the laughter drown out her pain? And that was the unspoken wound so many victims carried. Not just a violation of body, but a violation of memory, of truth, of voice, of the right to say, "This happened to me," without being called bitter, jealous, or confused. And still, even as both men denied the accusations, even as their lawyers drafted statement after statement framing them as victims of fame, targeted for money or revenge, the weight of the evidence kept rising. Photos, text, messages, audio recordings, eyewitness accounts, security footage, internal memos, canceled settlements, and above all, the aching, echoing similarity in every woman's voice, a tone too consistent to ignore, as if they had all been stitched together by trauma they never asked for. And while some fans remained loyal, spinning conspiracy theories about government takedowns or media framing, the majority of the public stood in a new clarity. This wasn't cancel culture. This was consequence culture, and it was long overdue. And as both cases dragged their weight into courtroom corridors lined with reporters and flashing bulbs, the world outside began to split open, no longer able to separate art from abuser, no longer willing to worship men built from others' pain. Because what began as stories of two powerful individuals spiraled into an indictment of an entire cultural sickness. A system where fame is armor and silence is currency. The more brilliant you are, the more cruelty you're allowed to wield behind closed doors. And so the women who once trembled now stood in witness boxes like warriors, not to relive their pain, but to reclaim it, to reframe it, to make the world understand that survival doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like staying, enduring, wearing the mask of a girlfriend or employee while dying on the inside. And one woman who worked under Diddy's fashion brand told the court how she was sent on errands that always led to hotel rooms, how she was praised when she smiled through discomfort, and punished with sudden job cancellations when she didn't. "You'll never work in the city again," he had once told her after she refused to join a post-party private session upstairs, and she didn't. Her emails went unanswered, her access revoked, and her passion turned into self-hatred. Similarly, a production assistant who had worked on Russell's sketch show in the early 2000s described how he would whisper disturbing jokes to her while the cameras were rolling, touching her back, sometimes her thigh, and making it seem like part of the act. "He made you feel like if you didn't laugh, you were the problem," she said. "And if you laughed, you hated yourself." And that contradiction, that constant loop of confusion, became the weapon he wielded best. The courtroom listened as more women described being love-bombed, then ghosted, then gaslit, and how the emotional violence never left visible scars but disfigured everything inside them, their confidence, their boundaries, their capacity to trust. Some wept openly while describing what they were the night it happened, how they had blamed themselves for wearing lipstick, for drinking wine, for walking and smiling. One woman said, "I said no, but I didn't scream. I froze. Does that still count?" And the courtroom, even the jury, seemed to shift with the weight of that question, because society had trained them all to believe that pain must be allowed to be real, that trauma must leave blood to be valid. But these stories taught a new language, one built not on bruises, but on breath, the kind of breath that gets stolen mid-sentence, held in fear, and never returned until years later in court, under oath, under tears. Meanwhile, outside the courtrooms, public opinion turned into a battleground. Some insisted on innocence until proven guilty. Some demanded jail. Some said nothing, unsure how to reconcile their love for old albums or movies with the horror unfolding now. And the media couldn't stop playing hits. Diddy's iconic "I'll Be Missing You" soundtracking headlines of raids and trafficking allegations. Russell's old stand-up clips being picked apart frame by frame like puzzles hiding monsters in plain sight. And the men, these once untouchable gods, began to disintegrate in real time. Diddy shut down public appearances, vanished from Revolt TV. Ciroc pulled his branding. His once loyal staff leaked stories of rage fits and paranoia, of safes and basements and panic buttons in the studio, of girls cry behind locked doors and being told, "Don't ask, don't interfere." Russell doubled down on his spiritual rebrand, releasing cryptic videos about truth seekers and universal awakening. But his eyes betrayed him, wide, tired, like a man running from his own reflection, like someone who knew the curtain had finally fallen, and there would be no encore. And still, through all the denial, the lawyers, the carefully worded statements, the public had already made its decision. Not because of cancel culture, but because of the unbearable consistency in every survivor's story, the tiny specific details that no liar could make up, like the smell of certain cologne, the layout of a recording room, the way the hallway creaked at night, the words whispered right before the silence, the threats, the praise, the manipulation, the eerie stillness that came afterward, and the survivors. Oh, the survivors. They began finding each other, messaging across platforms, forming sisterhoods born not out of friendship but out of survival, one saying, "I thought it was just me," and another replying, "It never was," and together they stitched a new narrative, one that didn't depend on the court's timeline, one that didn't beg for validation, one that simply said, "We're done being quiet, we're done carrying their secrets, we're done." And the deeper the world leaned in, the more grotesque the details became, not because they were surprising, but because they weren't, because somewhere deep down, everyone already knew that power corrupts and that we, as a culture, are often too entertained to interrupt it. And now the receipts were everywhere, in lawsuit exhibits, in archived interviews, in behind-the-scenes footage showing girls flinching at Diddy's touch, women turning away from Russell's jokes, assistants avoiding eye contact, all of it there in plain sight for years, but blurred by success, softened by popularity. And now that the blur had lifted, the picture was horrifyingly sharp, and the media couldn't look away. Not because it cared about justice, but because it finally had something it could no longer pretend was fiction. So documentary crews sprang into action. Journalists dug through decade-old files. YouTubers made content dissecting everything from Diddy's lyrical double meanings to Russell's offhand remarks about not caring if it's legal, and every piece added fuel to a fire already spreading like a storm across every corner of the internet. Burned the empire, and surviving Diddy clashed with defenders crying foul, claiming witch hunt, or jealous exes, or cancel culture, as if those phrases could somehow erase the sheer number of voices saying the exact same thing in different words from different years in different cities. Like a haunting chorus that no one could shut out anymore, the men, once deified, now looked like statues melting under heat. Diddy reportedly lost over $100 million in deals within 6 months, brands fleeing his legacy like rats from a burning yacht, while former collaborators began re-recording songs to remove his name, and Revolt TV, which he once used as a personal throne, publicly distanced itself, quietly phasing him out of leadership, while pretending they never knew what happened in the shadows of their boardrooms. And Russell, who once filmed daily videos surrounded by candles and quotes about healing, now looked gaunt, disconnected, almost cornered. Each new upload met with fury instead of faith, and though he spoke of unity and love, he never once named the women who accused him, never said their names or acknowledged their pain, and that silence roared louder than any denial. Meanwhile, inside the courtrooms, victims sat with tissues clenched in fists, with palms shaking as they held up photos or showed messages or played audio clips that made even the clerks wince. And one woman, her voice trembling like a flame, said she was once told by Russell, "No one's ever going to believe you. You're boring." And those 5 words had followed her for 15 years, echoing through job interviews, relationships, therapy sessions, until finally, she spoke them in front of a judge, and the courtroom didn't laugh, didn't flinch. They just listened. Another woman, who had traveled across state lines to attend the trial, said she never planned to speak until she saw Diddy's name trending again and realized that the man who assaulted her behind the tinted windows of a limo was still profiting off liquor sales and TV deals. And something in her snapped. She said, "I wasn't scared anymore. I was furious, and it was that fury, that raw, unfiltered rage that began replacing shame as a dominant emotion among survivors. Because when you live with trauma long enough, it either eats you or fuels you, and these women were done being consumed." Support groups began forming around the world, women who didn't even know each other connecting through DMs, anonymous forums, burner emails, some just typing out their story for the first time, some just saying "me too," and finding peace in the echo. Even men began coming forward, not as perpetrators, but as witnesses, former assistants, club promoters, bodyguards, all admitting they'd seen things, that they had chosen silence, that they had once believed their job was to protect the empire at all costs, even if it meant hiding the blood under the velvet carpet. And one of Diddy's former security team said during a deposition, "We knew. We all knew. But we also knew what happened to people who talked." His voice breaking on the last word, because complicity is a prison too, and now the doors were being opened, whether for accountability or for redemption, no one could say. But they were opening, and with every confession, the illusion cracked further. And yet, as always, there were still those who refused to see, who still posted Diddy's music with captions like "Legend Forever," or quoted Russell's jokes like gospel, unwilling to accept that the people they admire were predators, because accepting that meant admitting they had cheered for pain, that they had paid for it, danced to it, laughed with it, and that realization was too much for some. But for others, it was liberation, a way to finally step out of the fog and see clearly, to stop excusing, to stop forgetting, to finally say, enough. And when all the lights dimmed, when the headlines stopped screaming and the courtroom slowly emptied, what remained wasn't just the legal outcomes, which still crawled through bureaucratic mud, but the emotional verdict already etched into public consciousness, that no amount of fame could erase the rot behind the smile, that the true empire these men built wasn't music or comedy or entertainment, but control, silence, and a legacy of harm disguised as genius. Diddy no longer walked red carpets. He hid behind lawyers, behind iron gates, in homes that now felt like cages, surrounded by ghosts of women who once trusted him. While Russell Brand no longer filmed from sunlit rooms, but from shadows, his words increasingly abstract, almost unhinged, as if he no longer believed them. Both men, in different ways, had become exactly what they feared most. irrelevant, exposed, reduced to symbols of everything we're no longer willing to excuse, and the world, though still broken in many ways, had changed, not perfectly, but undeniably, because their victims, their survivors, had shifted the tide not just through testimony, but through sheer existence, by refusing to disappear, by choosing to speak when it would have been safer to vanish, and their courage planted seeds that would grow in rooms they'd never enter, in voices yet to break, in hearts once too afraid to beat. And in that final quiet reckoning, what rang louder than any court verdict was this unshakable truth: that power may build empires, but truth burns them to the ground, and when it does, it's not the scream of the guilty that matters. It's the voices of the ones silenced, rising together like a wave, saying, never again,